All right, so people can join in as the webinar continues, but we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome. You can see some tips are on that screen there, as well as how to stay in touch with us. Please keep in mind that this is going to be recorded and it will be viewable on YouTube and our website later. So you may want to keep your videos off, and we definitely ask that you keep your microphones muted. Please do submit your questions to the chat. I will be monitoring the chat. We can head to the next slide, and I'll ask the questions at the end. So today we're going to dive deep into dolphin social avoidances. And I'm Kel Malillo Sweeting. I'm chatting to you from Bimini, the Bahamas, and I'll be monitoring that chat, and we'll ask our questions at the end. So I'm going to pass it over to Alexis, who I haven't seen in far too long, but it will be nice to see her today. Alexis actually began as a DCP intern. So she started her field experience here in Bimini with DCP. She went on to get her master's degree and then her PhD. And so she is calling us today from Australia, and I'm going to turn it over to her. Welcome, Alexis, and thank you.
Thanks, Cal. I am here in Australia and I do have my window open. So if the birds outside, it's early here. So if the birds outside are quite annoying to you guys listening, please message it in the chat and I will close my window. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you guys, like Cal said, about social avoidances. So let's start. All right, so generally speaking, we know dolphins as these really social animals, highly intelligent, very friendly, very playful. And I did just a little word cloud over here looking at basically different papers, different research groups like DCP and like the one I work for this project, as well as places like Nat Geo and other research groups that and educational groups that look into dolphin research. And those are the common things we see. We see this really social, really playful individuals. I'm actually going to escape from this PowerPoint slide for a second because hold on. My computer tells me it's going to restart, which we definitely don't want it to do. Give me 1 second. Snooze, you're not letting me snooze. All right, well. Share. Okay. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so we were talking about sociality and we're talking about how dolphins were very social. And realistically, when we think about sociality, there's actually 2 sides to it. So there's this idea of affiliation, which is this attraction to individuals. So it's non-aggressive, friendly interactions. And across the animal kingdom, so all animals, including humans, this is really, really well studied. But unfortunately, in the flip side of this, we actually don't know as much. So the flip side of this is this idea of avoidance or aversion. So this is animals that are never seen together or seen together less than what we would expect if they were just moving randomly through their environment. And what we see is that this is really, really poorly studied. So when I was starting my PhD, I kind of thought, okay, well, maybe this is an avenue that needs to be studied. So let's try and find out more about it. In saying that, avoidances are actually quite difficult to study. And that's because when we think about affiliation or friendships, it's really easy to see 2 individuals together, right? It's very simple to be like, okay, those 2 people are hanging out together, or those 2 cats are playing together. It's easy to see the grouping of individuals, but it's quite difficult to actually see individuals not associating because it's this lack of an interaction. It's this lack of individuals coming together. So the question then was, is this even happening? Or is this something that, animals don't really do, or we can't exactly measure quite yet? So in 2017, myself and some colleagues actually wrote a paper about how to do this. And what was really exciting is that we could basically say, you know, these solid lines that we see here are actually just those affiliations, but now we can assign these dotted lines where individuals aren't being seen together, but we should expect them to. So that was super exciting because that meant, okay, I can answer these questions that I'm quite interested in. And to do this, I actually did my research in Monkey Maya, Shark Bay, Western Australia. So in the bottom picture, if you look, we're talking about the west coast of Australia, and we're talking about this pretty protected bay off of this peninsula. And part of the reason I could do this research here is this is one of the longest running dolphin projects in the world, which is really exciting. They started their research in 1984, and they're really, really well-studied dolphins, which is awesome. We know so much about them. So it allows me to kind of ask these really intricate questions about their social life. So in Shark Bay, since 1984, we've about 1,700 known individuals, which is a lot. They're not all there at the same time. Like I said, that's since 1984, so some of them have passed away. But generally speaking, in a given field season, which can be anywhere from about 3 months to 6 or 7 months, we'll usually see about 500 or 600 individuals in that season, and that's constantly changing every year. So in Shark Bay, I wanted to know, how much do dolphins avoid? We now can say that we can measure avoidances, and that's awesome. And we can do that by thinking about how they use their space. So if I look at how much space I use and how much space my neighbor use, how much do we overlap in space, and how much is it expected that we would interact with one another? So what I found was that they avoid tons. And like I said before, we know dolphins as these really social animals having friends. But what we see is actually dolphins are avoiding each other even more than they have their friends. So it's really exciting because this is something that no one's ever realized and no one's ever really looked into until now. But then the question is, what are these avoidances? Because, okay, great, we can measure that they have this behavior that no one's ever looked at in almost any species in the world. But what is it? Do we have any idea? So some of the questions I thought were, could it be social isolation? Could it be withdrawal? Could it be this antisocial behavior? And even more specifically, could it be introversion versus rejection, which we see in human societies, where some individuals are less social by choice, some individuals are rejected and kind of forced into that less social behavior. And like I said before, this hasn't really been well studied in animals. So the first place I was able to really look and find some answers was in humans, because we are actually probably the only species where we've looked into any kind of avoidance behavior and what that might mean for us. And social avoidances in humans have been linked to social isolation and withdrawal. And they're actually symptoms of syndromes and social disorders like antisocial behavior, social anxiety disorder, and quite a few others. But what's really interesting is that avoidances always have this negative relationship with measures of sociality. So things like gregariousness, and gregariousness is just how often you're seen with others, but also things like extroversion and outgoingness that we see in humans. So I want to know, is this similar in animals, or are we completely different? And based off those things, I wondered, well, could this be antisocial? You know, we're seeing disorders, and we're seeing withdrawal and isolation, and we're seeing this negative trend across the board. So is it antisocial? And what the human literature does really, really well is actually show that it's not antisocial behavior. And that's because antisocial suggests this dichotomy, so this mutual exclusivity. So it's either one or the other, of social or not social. When in reality, in humans, researchers suggest that it's this continuum. So it's this idea that affiliation and avoidance operate on a continuum relationship, in a continuum scale. So let's try it with dolphins. And that's what I did for my first project during my PhD. So I looked at these avoidances in dolphins, and I looked at 5 measures of what animal behavior researchers use to kind of measure sociality in animals. One of those is gregariousness. Like I said, we measure this in humans as well. It's just how often you're seen with another individual. We also measured this thing called preferences, which is the idea of kind of best friends or friends. So these kind of, the individuals that you spend the most time with. And then these last 3 are just measures that we use to kind of look at everyone you're connected to, so your social network. And these measures actually calculate quantitatively measures about how you fit in that network and what that means about how social you are. So what we first found, which was that our avoidances were negative and all of our other measures were positive. And we're seeing this negative trend across every single measure, which is exactly what we saw in the humans, right? We saw gregarious as negative, we saw extroversion, introversion. So it's the same idea. It's having this very negative relationship, I shouldn't say very, but it's having this negative relationship with these affiliative friendly measures that we use. But then there's a second part of this analysis. And what the second part showed us is even though our measure was still negative, so were 3 other measures. And what it's telling us here is that there's something more going on than just these are opposites of one another. And it's telling us that something about avoidances is common to these other measures, which is exciting because this is kind of what we thought might be happening, but we're actually seeing it in numbers. And when we looked at our figures, what we saw was that there's actually this massive amount of variation. So a dolphin might have the same level of gregariousness. So it might be as social as another, but have polar opposites in how many avoidances it had, which is really interesting because that just tells us there's a lot of individual variation here, kind of like there is in humans. We're all very different from one another. So then what we also thought about here was if we thought this was going to be antisocial, we would expect our data points to kind of fit into these 2 red circles where you'd have some here and some here, but not much in between. But we're not really seeing that. We're seeing a lot of points all over the place. And what this suggests is just like in humans, sociality is operating on this continuum where you have avoidances and other affiliative friendly behaviors that are operating throughout this measure. And what we see is that we have hypersocial individuals at one end, and those are individuals that have tons of friends and very few avoidances. So this is your social butterfly. This is your really social person at work or at school who everybody gets along with, and it's just, they don't really avoid a lot of individuals. But then at the other end of this continuum, you might have your antisocial individuals where they have a lot of avoidances, but they don't really have a lot of friends, whether that's by their own choice or by someone else's choice. They kind of are just sitting at the opposite end of this spectrum. I apologize because there's a plane going by. But it's really interesting because we can see that everything kind of works together on this continuum. So then I thought, okay, well, that's great, but why do they do it? What is the benefit of avoiding? Why would you avoid? We all know having friends is a benefit to us. We all know that there are health benefits, there are social benefits, there are many things that make having a friend really worth it for us. But why do you avoid? And what we thought is it actually might be a coping strategy to help minimize social conflict. And the reason we thought this is because in human and primates, monkeys, we actually see that short-term avoidances, so a withdrawal from a conflict or a fleeing behavior, actually is used to reduce conflict. And so we thought, okay, well, maybe because this shorter version of our behavior happens in humans and primates, it might happen longer term as well. And I'm looking at dolphins, so let's see if that's what happens. So the first thing I did was I looked at density, and I wanted to see if you lived with just a few dolphins or if you lived with a lot of dolphins, how that might impact your behavior. So if we look at the dolphins on the right, there are city dolphins, high dense, lots of dolphins around them. And our dolphins on our left are our more rural, suburban dolphins that only have a few dolphin families or friends nearby. And what we see actually is a really cool trend. So if we look at this graph, on the bottom we have density. So closer to 0, that means you only have 1 or 2 dolphins per kilometer of your home range. But if you look further on the right side of the graph, it means you have 12 dolphins, which is a lot per kilometer of your home range. So that's our density scale. And our scale on our y-axis over here is just basically showing us a ratio of how much they avoid to how much they affiliate or have friends. And what we see is at the bottom, we have individuals that avoid a lot less and affiliate more. So those are our more hypersocial, popular dolphins. And up top, we have individuals that avoid more and affiliate less. So those are our more asocial or antisocial dolphins. And what's really interesting is we see this kind of curved trend where as the density increases, individuals are avoiding a lot more and affiliating a lot less. We see it kind of tapers, and that might be because there's a maximum density that's physically possible in a dolphin's home range. But what's really interesting here is that what we think it's telling us is that during low risk of conflict, it pays to be more affiliative. So it's beneficial when there's little conflict to be friendly. But when there's a high risk of conflict or issues, then it actually pays to avoid more. And we think this all has to do with minimizing effects of group living. So I thought, okay, that's great. But density is really kind of a crude measure of what's going on. It's this really broad measure. So we know there's a lot of dolphins around, but what are those dolphins doing? And why is it a problem? So the first thing I thought about was, okay, maybe they're competing for something, and especially resources. So what we know about mammals is that generally speaking, females will compete with other females for food. So that's a foraging competition measure. And what that is, why that's happening is because dolphins actually are, female dolphins are having the offspring, they're having their babies. So that takes a long time. And then they're also raising those babies. So they have to also produce milk for those babies. And that's energetically very taxing. Anybody that's on here that is a mother definitely understands that. Anybody who's not a mother may still understand it or may not at all. But basically, it takes a lot of energy to raise a baby. And in the dolphin world, males don't really stick around. It doesn't really serve them to invest as much in the offspring once it's born. So for them, they're actually competing for access to females. And that's because the more females that they can get access to, the more likelihood that they can make that offspring with the female. So we thought, let's look at how female-female relationships change or interact with food competition, and how male-male relationships change based on mating competition. And the great thing about Shark Bay is, this is actually a map of Shark Bay. So this is the land, this is all part of the ocean, and the different colors on here are the different habitats we have. So Shark Bay is really diverse in the habitats that exist underwater. And that's really exciting for us because we can kind of ask more intricate questions. And what we see is actually there are 6 habitats, and we kind of break them down into about 4, really. We have our shallow habitats, which are these pink and green colors. And then we have our deeper habitats, which are these purpley blue and yellow colors. And I'll go into that some more once I go through some of these results. But I wanted to see how these measures of competition interacted with the habitat and maybe affected the behaviors that we're seeing. So the first thing we found was that females increase their avoidances with increased resource competition based on the habitat that they're in. And I'm going to break that down for you and make this graph make sense to you so it's not too much and overwhelming. But basically what we have on the y-axis is our avoidances, and what we have on our x-axis is how much competition they're experiencing. And these lines just represent different habitats. So the solid line here represents our deep habitats, and I'll show you a little map again. And our dotted line on this first graph shows our shallow habitats. So our shallow habitats are those pink and green, the seagrass and the sandflats. And then our deep habitats actually represent what we call the channel and the deep open waters. And they're just both deep habitats that vary slightly in their depth, in their substrate, and in how much water flows and the speed in which the water flows through them. So that's interesting, but what we also found was that these deep habitats, we can break them down, right? We can break them down into the two. And interestingly, we see very different trends here. So we see that in the channel, which is that yellow habitat, there's not much of a trend, but in the deep open, we see a similar trend to what we're seeing in those shallow habitats. But no matter what, females are avoiding more as resource competition, so competition for food increases no matter where they live. Males, on the other hand, do something a little bit different. So males will either increase or decrease their avoidances with increased competition based on that habitat. So we'll do the habitat map again. And what we found with the males is this was only true for the channel and the deep open. So that is those deeper habitats. There was no effect for the shallow habitats for the males. And what we see is similarly to the females, in the deep habitat, we see this massive spike up. But in the channel habitat, as opposed to the females, we actually see a decrease. So for males, as resource competition increases, it really depends on what habitat they live in to determine how they behave, whether they avoid more or they avoid less. And what that is telling us, that if there's variation in the amount of competition you experience, that actually maintains the variation in your social behavior. So how much you avoid. We also did this for preferences, which is our friends, but I don't have enough time to talk to you guys about everything. So we're just going to focus mostly on avoidances today. But it basically tells us that this variation in resource competition is actually driving our variation in social behavior. Okay, so that's great. So we know that food competition is driving female-female avoidances, and mate competition is driving male-male avoidances. But then I wondered what's happening between females and males, because they don't live in their own bubble that no one touches. They're in this same group. And because we know males compete for access to our females, we actually know that the females experience sexual harassment from the males. So it's usually a group of males that will herd a female away from her family and friends to try and mate with her. And so I wondered, well, okay, is sexual harassment possibly driving females' avoidance of males? So we thought about what strategies could females use to minimize this kind of harassment that they experience. And one could possibly be to avoid males. So we'll look into that. But the other possibility is that they might befriend males and actually make males allies, because it could serve them to have buddies around to kind of keep other males away. It's the idea of like having a big brother that keeps the boys away. And in the same aspect, I was curious about how our variation in the habitat maybe affected this. And what we see is really interesting. And again, I'll break this down for you. So on our x-axis is down here, we have sex ratio. So that's just the amount of males to females in the population. So the higher the ratio, the more competition. And on our y, we have our avoidances. In our first plot, we see individuals that are using the deep open, and we see a huge trend, right? As they experience more competition, as males experience, as more sexual harassment is experienced, that's what I meant to say, not competition, my apologies, by the females, avoidances are increasing. But we're not seeing that trend in the channel habitat or in the shallow habitats, which is very interesting. But we see something quite similar when we look at preferences. So this idea of maybe the allies. We're seeing this line, this trend line going up, but not really anything happening for the channel, and very, very little happening for the shallow habitats. And what this is telling us is that there's a there's a habitat-specific strategy, sorry. And that's super interesting, but also not surprising when you find out that the males in Shark Bay, when they actually are trying to herd the females for mating opportunities, they pull them into this deep open water. So it's really maybe not surprising that we're seeing more behavioral variation and trends here, because this is where they're experiencing most of that harassment, as opposed to these other two habitats where they're not experiencing it to the same extent, and therefore maybe don't need to react and behave in the same way. So this is super cool. What it's telling us is that variation in resource competition and variation in the risk of sexual harassment are both working together to maintain variation in the social behavior of our dolphins. So competition is driving male-male and female-female behavior, and sexual harassment seems to be driving female-male behavior. So then for the last thing I wanted to look into was, okay, we now know that dolphins have friends and they have these avoidances, but do friends share these friends and avoidances? And this is something that we see in humans, that friends share friends, but also that friends share enemies. And so it's this idea that relationships are most stable when they're in balance. So it's that the friend of my friend is going to still be my friend, but the enemy of my friend is going to be my enemy. So the question was, can I test this in dolphins, and do they do this? And super cool, they definitely do. What we see here actually is that friends are the main driver of dolphins sharing their friends, but also dolphins sharing their avoidances. So we see that same triangle happening with the dolphins that we saw with the humans. The dolphin friends will share their friends, but dolphin friends will also share their avoidances. And that's really cool because we see quite a similar pattern where, you know, there's a lot of sharing happening for friends and avoidances. And this is just showing that if we're friends, this is how much proportionally we will share of our avoidances and how much we will share of our friends. So then I wondered, okay, well, how is this happening? And what we know about a lot of different species, and especially humans and mammals, is that social transmission occurs for a lot of species. And that's where information is passed on from one to another. So it's learned or taught behavior. So if we think about humans, when you're little, you learn a lot from your parents, from your mom and your dad, maybe even your siblings. You also learn a lot from your peers. So we wondered whether information is being transmitted from dolphin to dolphin about who to befriend and whom to avoid. So if our blue dolphin here has a tealish colored blue dolphin friend, can the gray dolphin learn or be taught that information and realize that this is a dolphin that is worth befriending or worth avoiding? But the interesting thing about social transmission is it can happen through lots of different ways. And I kind of said a few earlier, but the first is through the mom. So directly from mother to offspring. And like I said before, the fathers, the males dolphins that are fathers don't actually invest much once the offspring's born. So offspring of dolphins will spend a lot of time with their mom when they're young because they're dependent on her, much like babies are. You know, they need food, they need protection, they need to be taught how to survive in their environment. So there's a lot of opportunity there for mom to teach dolphins. And for dolphins in Shark Bay, generally speaking, the babies will stay with the mom, so the calves will stay with the mom, on average up to age 4, but we've seen some young dolphins stay with their mom even up to age 8. So there's years and years of opportunity for dolphin mothers to share information and pass information on to their offspring. But in saying that, we might also have indirect transmission. So that's from mom's friends to the offspring. And this is where mom is still influencing you, but she's actually influencing you by the people she surrounds you with, and then they can influence you. So I often, when I tell this story to people, is I have an Aunt Kathy. She's not actually related to me in any way whatsoever. She is my mom's friend from high school. But Aunt Kathy and her family have been a part of my life since I was little. And I learned a lot from them because I spent a lot of time with them when I was young. I spent a lot of time with their children. And because of that, she likely had a lot of influence on my behavior as well. Now, finally, we actually have transmission through peers. And so that's through our friends. So this is completely non-maternal. It's friend to friend. And we see this a lot if you think about in humans. When you're little, your parents have a lot of influence over who you spend time with and what you're doing. But as you get older and you gain a little independence, you have a lot of influence from your peers. So friends from school, friends from extracurricular activities, friends from the neighborhood might have much more influence in your life because you get to spend more time with them as you become independent. So this is all well and good, but what's interesting is that we actually have a really limited understanding of these pathways and how they contribute to a lot of behavior, but especially the sharing of friends. No one really had any idea. There was a lot of emphasis on mom being influential because that's not really surprising, but I wanted to kind of disentangle the pathways and figure out how these different pathways could contribute to the sharing of friends and possibly even the sharing of acquaintances. All right, so I'm gonna walk you through this figure, and not everything is on this figure yet because I'm gonna go through it piece by piece. But what we're seeing is we're seeing two plots here. The plot on the left, plot A, is shared friends. You can see that here. And plot B is shared avoidances. And on our x-axis, we have half weight. And all half weight is a measure of how much time individuals spend together. And what we see is that we see, first, this is our maternal transmission. So orange is our direct maternal. So that's from mom to offspring. And we're seeing this positive slope. I'm going to go into that more in a second. Then we see indirect maternal. So that's our mom's friends. That's our blue line. And we're also seeing a positive slope. And then finally, our third transmission pathway is our friends, our non-maternal transmissions. Those are our peers. And that is that green slope here. And what we're seeing with that green slope is a similar pattern. So what we see is that the fact that all of these slopes are going upwards is telling us that social transmission is occurring for all of these. Oh.
Hey, Alexis, did we lose you entirely or did we just lose your screen? Or did you lose me? Kathleen, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
I just had to unmute myself.
Did we lose Alexis, does it sound like?
Maybe.
Okay. Well, we'll see if she can sort some of that out. And in the meantime, we can answer. There are a couple of questions that I think we can answer while we wait to see if we can get Alexis back. One of the questions was how to tell a female from a male. So we can find out from Alexis if how challenging that is at her field site there in Western Australia. In general, there is very little sexual dimorphism in dolphins. So that means like if you think of lions is kind of the prime example. I'm assuming no one on this call has an advanced degree in lions, but maybe you do. But I bet everyone could look at photographs of lions and tell an adult lion apart from a adult female lion. So with dolphins, we have to really, bottlenose dolphins, we have to get a good view of their bellies and we can see their different genital slits. And if anybody's interested in that kind of thing, you can check out our first dolphin lesson webinar on photo ID, and that'll go through the different ways to tell male and female dolphins apart.
And Cal?
Are you here, Alexis?
Not yet, but I did touch base with Alexis. This is Kathleen, and she said that unfortunately her computer decided to restart. So she is coming back, but she said there's a slight hiatus while it restarts, and then she re-logs in. So
excellent.
I double checked that with her.
Thank you for the update. I'm glad it's not only me who gets bested by the technology at times. Mm-hmm. So we'll find out from Alexis. The field site in Western Australia, the water is really clear. And so you can see a lot from the boat. I believe most, if not all of her research is boat-based. Here in the Bahamas, in Bimini, where we study common bottlenose and Atlantic spotted dolphins, we can't really tell males and females apart from the boat. the water's clear, but they don't roll over often enough. It's fast, it's hard to tell. But once we document by seeing their bellies, if they're male or female, we can add that information basically into their ID folder, so that we know which IDs are male or female. We can also see perhaps an adult who's repeatedly with a calf, and association of an adult with a calf doesn't automatically mean it's its mother, but when it's repeated, it can give us a good indication that that's probably mama. Let me check if there's anything else I can help answer while we wait for Alexis. One of our future webinars, I'll plug a future webinar instead. Our PhD student, Nicole, is going to discuss coefficients of association. So essentially what Alexis was talking about at the beginning, where it's more commonly studied, trying to understand which dolphins associate with each other. Well, we did that traditional study here at our Bimini field site with the Atlantic spotted dolphins. So in May, Nicole will lead that webinar, and we'll make sure everybody has access to that paper. You can get it on our website already if you want to read up in advance. And yeah, we'll talk about that in a little while. But we have yet to ask these types of avoidance questions here at our Bimini field site. Kathleen, have you ever looked at avoidances with the dolphins in Roatan or at Dolphin Encounters, where you can kind of see most of the dolphins all at once?
I figured I'd just say hi so I could come in and see you. Actually, when I was reading the paper that Alexis recommended that we read before she gave her presentation, I started thinking about that. And what I thought was interesting is the way avoidance was measured between the dragons and the dolphins in that paper, and how Alexis is presenting, relates to the coefficients of association that she measured with the half-weight index, as well as looking at how much time the individuals spend together versus apart. And in Roatan, we take that a step further, and we're looking at the types of behaviors those animals exchange. So I was actually really interested in asking Alexis whether she looked at any behaviors that might indicate avoidance or preference in terms of tactile contact or postures, or taking it that next step, and not just proximity measures, but looking at some of the more, I don't know, individual interactions. And I was thinking about that in terms of with people, sometimes what you do is I don't know, sometimes it's, especially in this time of social distancing, you can actually see the dirty looks people give you if you get too close, if you get within that 6-foot distance, if you're out and about, or if you're, or standing close to somebody where your personal distance is small with people that you know or that you're friendly with, whereas it could be larger with people that you don't know about. And so I was thinking about that after I'd read the paper.
One thing, as you listen to DCP webinars, and I see Alexis is back, so I'm going to pass it back to her in a minute, is we don't run out of questions to ask.
Very true.
We don't run out of research topics. We have struggles with how to ask the questions and how to collect the data sometimes, but we do not run out of questions. So I'm going to see if, oh, you know what? The ball might be in my court for a second.
Might have to unmute
Sorry
her.
about that. Let me just give Alexis her permission back. She's probably wondering what I'm doing.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathleen. I'm sorry, everybody. My computer, even though I told it not shut down, decided it wanted to be in charge. So I am just going to share my screen right now and get you guys back to the important stuff. Okay, so we're back on board. All right, so we talked about this a bit. So again, friends on the left, avoidances on the right, halfway on the bottom, which is just a measure of how much time individuals are together. We talked about mom, who's in orange, how much she's transmitting. We talked about mom's friends, who's in blue, and how much they're transmitting. And then we talked about our friends, our peers, who are not maternally related to us in any way whatsoever. And the last thing I think I said to you guys before my computer decided to robot control my life was that the fact that these slopes are positive is actually telling us that all three of these different transmission pathways are socially transmitting information. And basically what that means is that information is being passed from mom to offspring, mom's friend to offspring, and from peer to peer. And that's really exciting because nobody's actually ever showed that all three things are happening, and in some sense happening at the same time. So, okay, that's super exciting and really great, but there's also some other really cool parts to this graph that are require a little bit of keen eye to know. And basically one of those is that here at our y-intercept, we have different intercepts, right? So we see that the orange line is always ahead of the blue line, which is always ahead of the green line, and that is the same for both friends and avoidances. And that's cool because it's actually telling us something really, really interesting, which is that even if two individuals spend no time together, and I should preface this for you guys that we remove data when the offspring is a baby. So we're only looking at its juvenile and adult years. So once it's weaned away from mom, we're looking at those periods of time and what is influencing its behavior. And what we're seeing is that even if a juvenile or adult spends no time with its mom at all, zero, like gets weaned, doesn't need mom anymore, and is a strong, independent female or male. And what we see is that mom actually has a massive influence still, because mom is still sharing more with that offspring, even if they're not spending any time together, than any other individual. So the friends that mom and the avoidances that mom teaches their offspring last into adulthood. And that's really interesting because that hasn't really been shown well in a lot of species. And so really cool that mom is having such a big impact, and we can see that it extends, right? It goes over time. But also what we see is that because these lines all start at different points on the y-axis and all have different slopes, what it means is that the strength of the amount of social transmission that occurs depends on the relationship. So it depends on whether it's a mom and offspring pair, if it's a mom's friend and offspring pair, and whether it's just peers. But what's really cool is that initially mom has a huge influence on our lives, but as we become more independent from mom, it actually is our peers, that green line, and it's hard to see here, but the green line does cross the blue. But it's those peers that ultimately have the biggest influence over the dolphins. And if you think about humans, it's probably quite the same for humans. When we're little kids, mom and dad have huge impacts on our lives, right? They determine so much of what our life is and what our behavior ends up being. But as we become older and independent, our peers have a much, much more influential hold on our lives because we spend more time with them. We become like our peers. And you think about it, if you're older and you have a job, you come into the office and you and your office mate are wearing the exact same outfit or almost exact same outfit. Or if you're a kid at school and you were never into soccer ever when you were a little kid, but Joe is super into soccer and you're best friends with Joe, and because Joe's into soccer, you decide, okay, I'm gonna become more into soccer. Or maybe you don't decide, but you do anyways. So it's this influence that individuals are having over your relationships with others and your behaviors with others. And basically what all of this means is that social transmission is occurring, and our friends, and by our I mean dolphin friends and dolphin avoidances, are being transmitted both maternally, so that's mom and mom's friends, and non-maternally through our peers. But non-maternal transmission is having the greatest effect. So dolphin friends tend to be more like their non-maternal friends. And what we think all this is telling us, excuse me, is that it's actually this cumulative social learning. So initially the dolphin will learn from its mom, then it learns from its mom's friends, and then it ultimately ends up learning from its peers. So it's kind of these building blocks of learning in your social environment who is good and who is worth spending time with, and who is maybe the individuals you don't want to be spending so much time with. And if we think about it, it probably is a really important thing to know who is worth being a friend and who is worth not being a friend with, because there can be major consequences of those relationships. Having a good friend by your side could potentially mean life or death for dolphins. Having a bad friend on your side could potentially mean life or death for dolphins. So it probably serves to know who is worth befriending and who is worth avoiding. And so I'm just going to recap on what my research has kind of shown, because I've told you guys a lot, and obviously we've also been interrupted by technology here. But dolphins have a lot of avoidances. We believe that these avoidances operate along a social continuum with other affiliative, friendly, pro-social behaviors. We think avoidances serve as an additional or alternative strategy to minimize the cost of group living. So to minimize effects from density, to minimize effects of competition for resources, and to minimize the effects of harassment from males or females. And lastly, we know that friends and avoidances are being transmitted socially. And this is happening in 3 different pathways at varying degrees depending on the relationship. So that's my research, and I hope you guys are as interested or excited, or at least intrigued, if nothing else, about what I've been doing for the last 4.5, 5 years. But now I'm just going to spend a little bit of time kind of talking about how I got to where I am today. This is definitely geared towards students who are thinking about what they want to do in life and trying to figure out what they want to be when they grow up or get bigger or become an adult, which I don't think I exactly am yet. But it's just kind of my path to this point in my life. So here's the lovely world. I am from the States, even though I'm currently in Australia. You can probably figure that my accent sounds somewhat similar to hopefully yours. And I'm from a small place called Pottstown in Pennsylvania. And so I'm from a landlocked state, which was a bit of a challenge as a child because I was obsessed with the water. I loved the water and the ocean and the rivers and the ponds and every animal in it, and even all the animals outside of it. I loved being outside. I loved animals. I loved playing with nature. And it was just a massive part of who I was. My mom tells stories about when I was in, I think, elementary school. I'm pretty sure I was quite little. The school yearbook came and asked all the students what they want to be when they grow up. And everybody said normal things like a hairdresser, a fireman, an accountant, like normal parent jobs. And I said I wanted to study dolphins and whales. And my mom was like, where did you get that idea? And no one knows, because it wasn't anything that I was surrounded by. So I was fortunate in the sense that I had really good teachers and a supportive family around me that actually encouraged me to pursue the things that I was interested in. And I was interested in science, and I was good at science. And I had really encouraging teachers and mentors that kind of continued to light the flame that interested me and pushed me in the right direction and encouraged me to, no matter what, keep asking the questions I was asking and keep pursuing the things that I was interested in. So I remember when it was time to go to college, and it was a big decision. You know, you're 17 or 18 years old, and you're making a decision that seems huge because you're still a kid to some extent. And I said to my mom, I was like, oh, I just don't know. I knew I loved the marine environment, and I knew I loved animals, and I knew I loved science, but I was nervous that if I went to a school that focused solely on marine biology, that maybe I wouldn't like it in the end. And I thought, oh, what if I don't like it? What if I'm really bad at it? And not that being good at something is a reason that you should pursue anything, because I full-heartedly don't believe in that. But I still wanted to be decent at the thing that I loved. So I kind of talked with my mom, and we had this long chat, and I ultimately, with her help and her guidance, decided that I was going to go to a school up north that was a liberal arts school that offered me everything. So I went to a school I took classes in science, I took classes in art history, I took classes in English, I took everything. But within the science degree that I took, I focused so much on anything that was water related, which involved lots of marine courses, but also things like hydrology, which is the study of water movement, which is nothing to do with what I do now. But I took everything. I took freshwater courses, I took marine courses, and I just really tried to focus my attention within my degree on the things that I liked. And I got a degree in biology and environmental studies. I double majored, and I minored in psychology. And I was really fortunate because during my undergrad years, my university offered to help us to do an internship. And that is actually how I found DCP. And thank goodness, because it probably like completely steered my life. But in the summer of my junior year, so at 16, 17, I think is how old you are, I joined DCP as an intern. I spent half my summer in Connecticut with Kathleen doing research from the dolphins that are actually in Honduras. And then I spent the second half of my summer going down to the Bahamas and working with Kel and doing research with the dolphins in Bimini. And it was like I was bit by the bug. I loved it. And I was completely in my element. I got to go in the water every day. I got to film dolphins. I got to see really cool behavior. And I learned so much, and I just soaked it in like a sponge. And I, after my internship, went back to college for my final year and pretty much basically said to Kathleen, please keep me, because I really, really want to be a part of this. And luckily for me, she did. She decided I wasn't crazy and kept me as part of DCP. And I got to do some research projects with that DCP as part of my senior year, and also continued to work with DCP in different forms of volunteering and teaching a course and helping with the interns. And I went back and forth with DCP through different field experiences, probably I think for about 5, maybe even 6 years between 2009 and 2014 before I started my PhD. But after the Bahamas, I knew I was doing the right thing. I was following my passion and I was excited. And I knew that I was interested in the dolphins and I loved doing what I was doing. But I had, for a very long time, this obsession with manatees. And so after my internship with DCP, I went and did 2 more internships. And I did my first one with Moat Marine in Florida. That's over here. And I did manatee research. And I was so excited because I've always loved manatees. I still do. But I realized during my internship there that the thing I really loved about the dolphin research that I had done was that it was very behavior focused, and behavior really interested me. And unfortunately for me, manatee research was really focused on conservation, sorry, at the time, and still is, but it was really conservation driven, and conservation is massively important and something that I think all researchers still do very much care about. Whether how direct their research is related to conservation varies. But I realized that the questions I was really interested in, I wasn't going to be able to get the opportunities to ask them the way I wanted to with manatees that I could potentially do with dolphins. So after my internship with Moat, I went to Mississippi and did an internship on dolphins there, where I got to work with behavior and cognition of dolphins. And it was a really good experience to go there because I actually got to work in a research lab at a university and got to see firsthand kind of what a master's program and a PhD program would be like from the students that were working there that I worked with. And it gave me kind of this insight of, okay, well, I think I can do that. And so I started applying for master's programs and PhD programs and also other internships because I knew I wanted to keep kind of figuring out what interested me the most. And I knew behavior was something that I was really keen for. I knew dolphins were a great vessel in which to study this. But I wanted to keep doing research and I wanted to keep traveling. So the next thing I did was I actually flew to Italy. I don't speak any Italian. My mother can tell you that I cried when I got to the airport because I was very nervous that I was going to be in a country where I couldn't speak the language, but it was fine. but I did dolphin and whale research there. And again, primarily focusing on behavior, but also some environmental factors. And when I was there, I was, again, learning a lot of things that I liked and learning the things I didn't like. And I think both of those things are very important as you're pursuing the things that you're interested in, because learning what you do like is just as important as learning as what you don't like. It helps form the path of what you're interested in. So after Italy, I kind of got to a point where I was like, okay, I really like dolphins and I really like animal behavior, but I also really like sharks, which are not dolphins. So I decided to go, I got offered a position to go to South Africa. And so I moved to South Africa and I did great white shark research in South Africa for a few months. And the great thing about this internship experience was I got to try something new, which was work with sharks, which are actually just big fish, essentially. I got to work with huge sharks, so great whites, but I also got to work with smaller benthic sharks that live in more like coastal areas and less deep water. And I also still got to be involved with some dolphin and whale research, because although the primary research was on sharks, they still had a bit of a dolphin project going that we got to work with. And it was an amazing experience and I loved my time there. But while I was there, I really missed the dolphin research. And it kind of stuck in my head that, okay, yeah, this is the thing that I like the most. This is the thing that I am passionate about. And this is the thing that I want to keep pursuing. And while I was in South Africa, previous to going to South Africa, I had applied for a master's degree. And I found out in South Africa that I was accepted into the program. So I moved back home, packed up all my things, and I moved to Scotland. And in Scotland, I went to the University of St. Andrews and I did a master's in marine mammal science there. And the reason I chose Scotland and St. Andrews specifically is they have one of the best marine mammal programs in the world. And I'd gotten to that point where I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure marine mammals is what I want to do. And dolphins in particular seems to be the species that I am operating with the most. And I knew I wanted to do behavioral research, and they have some really great behavioral researchers there. So I went to St. Andrews. I did my master's degree for a year there. I got my master's and I decided to stick around because I loved Scotland and Scottish people so much. But while I was in Scotland, I was applying for PhDs because I got to the point at the end of my master's going, yep, okay, I really like doing this and I know I can keep doing it and I can keep pushing and go to the next level. So I applied for some PhDs and I got an offer to move to Australia. And my university here in Australia is on the East Coast. So basically like the New York side of America. And we have kangaroos on campus, so that photo is very accurate. But part of the reason I chose this PhD is I got to travel, but I also got to travel within Australia because my research, even though my uni was on the East Coast, my research was on the West Coast. So I went to school on the East Coast for about 6 months of the year, and then the other 6 months of the year, I would move to the West Coast and go to Shark Bay, which we talked about earlier, and study the dolphins there. And starting probably before my internship with DCP, so when I was still an undergrad, I had been reading about the dolphins of Shark Bay, and I had just said, you know, I just really would love an opportunity to work with these dolphins. They're so well studied. We know so much about them, and I'd love to have that experience. And part of the reason I chose this PhD was because that was going to give me that experience, and it was definitely worth it. So the point of me kind of telling you my life story really is to show you that success is really not linear. I mean, if you look at my path, I zigzagged all over the world, let alone America. And there's lots of little stars that aren't on here that I got to go do and travel and see. But my best advice, and I'm happy to answer any kind of questions about what any students or people would like to know about how to get to this point, is to really follow your passions and follow the things that interest you and the things that excite you, because that's essentially what I did. And I was given probably the best advice of my life from Kathleen when I was with her as an intern at some point in the 5 or 6 years I was with them. And I was really frustrated at one point because when I finished my undergrad, I wanted to get my master's and get my PhD and start my life and be an adult and just be Alexis, the dolphin researcher. And I wanted that to just start and happen. I was ready. And Kathleen sat me down and said to me, she's like, it's not about getting from point A to point C. She said, it's about the journey of getting to all those places in between that lead you to that final place. And it resonated with me massively. And it was something I really needed to hear because I was losing my mind being stressed out. And it's something I constantly tell myself still, because I often still freak out and go, oh my God, am I doing the right thing? Oh my goodness. I moved across the entire world and I'm in the middle of a country where none of my family or friends are near me. Am I doing the right thing? And the reality is all of these little lines and all of these stars have made me the person and the researcher that I am today. So it is very much about the process and about the journey and about following the things that excite you and that interest you, that are going to really keep you going because they're the things that you're passionate about. So that is essentially my story and my advice. Follow your passions. Don't let anyone tell you you can't do it. And it isn't easy. That's, I guess, the last thing. It is hard. There definitely have been times where I have struggled and I've had to pull myself up from the bootstraps and say, you know, you can do this with support and help from family and friends and mentors like Kathleen and Cal. But it's definitely worth following the things that excite you, because that will keep you engaged with your work for the rest of your life. So in saying all that, I just want to show you guys some pretty cool photos of all the dolphins that I've worked with in Shark Bay and some of the really cool things I've gotten to see while doing my PhD over here. I could spend 3 hours just going through photos of awesome, exciting things I've gotten to do and see during my research experiences throughout the past couple decades. But in that, I would like to say thank you to those that have supported me. So the Shark Bay Dolphin Research Project that I have worked for the past few years, and the Dolphin Resort that we get to stay at while we're over there. Also DBCA, which is a government body that helps support us. And DCP for having me come talk to all of you, and especially Kathleen and Cal for being incredible women mentors in science and in the marine mammal community. Like, they have been amazing people to call colleagues and friends. And then finally, all the funding bodies that help support me do my research over the past few years. And I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure if Kel and Kathleen have gone through some of the things that they like to talk to you guys about, I think, before I do questions, since I got cut off. But if Kathleen or Kel needs to talk first, I will let them, and then I will answer whatever needs to be answered.
Hello. We probably have time for a question or two. Alexis, can you bump to those last couple of slides? I'll just get everybody wrapped up before I ask your questions. If anyone wants to find where we store these webinars, you can just head to dolphincommunicationproject.org. Under the education tab, you'll find all the webinars and kind of like the schedule for the next 10 days or so. And you can also go to YouTube and just search for Dolphin Communication Project. The webinars aren't our only thing. We also have our podcast, the Dolphin Pod, and that covers lots of other dolphin stories and information, a little comedic at times. And I think I already mentioned while we were waiting for Alexis to come back that we have this kind of older audience webinar, our Dives Deep series, and then we also have the Dolphin Lesson series, which is geared more towards elementary students, but we think everyone will enjoy them. Our next Dolphin Lesson is next Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern time. And then Alexis, if you'll just head to the very last slide, just so that if anybody has to exit before we do questions, you can see our social media and our email and stuff there. So stay in touch, don't be strangers. And of course, we're a little nonprofit, so support is always welcome. I'm modeling our headband, and right now we are also trying to pay it forward for all of those essential workers who are out there working hard, people who are just having a really hard time with this pandemic. Maybe they've lost their job or just having a real hard time coping. So anybody who makes a purchase from our website, particularly these 3 starred things, our dolphin adoptions, memberships, or t-shirts and hoorag bandanas. If you spend $15, you can choose someone to receive a free dolphin adoption kit, the electronic version, the email version. So we want to try, and there's not a lot we can do, we're dolphin researchers, to give back, but we thought this was one thing that we could do to help out. So Alexis, some of the questions we got, we covered during your reboot.
Awesome.
But one thing about females avoiding males, do you think that that's ever in anticipation of finding a better mate? Or do you think it's strictly about avoiding that quote unquote harassment?
That's a great question. Yes, and there's a lot we still don't know. I guess I should start with that. So female choice in dolphin mating is still something that's really unknown. We know what the males do, but we're not really sure how much say females have. But we think from some results that I didn't show you, that there may be some potential, what we call cryptic female choice. So females are basically having their say in more discreet ways than like grabbing a female and pulling her into the deeper water. So we think, yes, they might be avoiding males to possibly get access to better mates. They might be avoiding males because they still have very young offspring with them and they're not ready to risk that weaning period still. We don't know exactly, but we have another researcher who's trying to ask some of those questions, and hopefully we'll have answers in the next 4 years.
Thank you. Are there dolphins in this study group that you ever see completely alone at times?
Ooh, it's an interesting question because dolphins are very social, and I've said it a million times, and we do have a lot of avoidances, but I've never seen a dolphin that is never with someone else at some point. I have seen quite a few dolphins that more often than not are alone, but usually, especially female offspring, as they get older in this population, they tend to come back and kind of check on mom to make sure she's okay and spend a little bit of time with her. So what we see is those dolphins that are a little bit less social and more on the avoidance scale will kind of maybe only have a few friends. So they might only be seen with 2 or 3 individuals, and maybe those 2 or 3 individuals are their offspring when they're adults.
Thank you. And this is one of my questions to go along with sort of your path and helping people see that dolphin research isn't always what it looks like when you tune into Discovery Channel.
100%.
How many years of data did you actually use for this study? And how long did this analysis that you did, how long did it take?
Awesome questions. Dolphin research, I mean, Kelly, you'll understand because we do this, but it's got this, it's very shiny, it's exciting. You're on a boat, you're in the water, you get to spend a lot of time with the dolphins. Reality is I spend way more time with my computer than I do with the dolphins. But my data in particular for these projects was 30 years of data. So 1988 to 2017. So at the time, that was my entire lifespan. Obviously, I did not collect all of that data. I wasn't, 6 months outside, 6 months old outside in the ocean trying to collect dolphin data. But our research project here has been going on since 84. So there's been plenty of researchers that have helped contribute to this. And then I spent 7 months my first year, and then through increments of 3 months. So I probably spent about a year and a half actually in the field collecting data for this project. And then I spent the other 4 years analyzing the data. So definitely more time at the computer than at the water.
And as a little wrap-up question, folks are wondering what you've been up to since you got your PhD and what's next for you.
Oh, awesome question. So I was awarded my PhD in November, just in time for me to get a visa to stay here a little bit longer. And now I am working at the university where I got my degree from. I'm teaching some courses here and kind of wrapping up some of my projects. I'm trying to publish all my papers because nothing has been published yet. So you guys are getting, you know, first end, getting to hear it first, and no one else knows about this yet exactly. So I'm publishing my work, I'm teaching courses, and I'm starting some other research and helping out researchers in my lab. And I just want to say, I'm going to go back to a few slides if I can. Oh, I don't know if I can. Yeah, here. If anybody hasn't been able to ask a question and would like to ask a question to me because we've run out of time, please feel free to email me. I really don't mind. That's my email there. You can also follow me on Twitter, just like you should follow DCP. They do really awesome stuff. Thumbs up for that. But yeah, feel free if you didn't get to ask your question or you have a question but maybe are a little bit nervous to say it to everybody, please feel free to email me and ask me anything. I'm happy to answer anything else.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alexis. And thank you to everyone who joined. If Alexis's email is cut off, you can always email info@dcpmail.org. So info@dcpmail.org, and we can get your question to Alexis. So thanks everybody for joining, and hopefully we'll see you at another webinar. Have a great night or day, depending on where you are.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.